Of course, every army, including my own, has things that need improvement. It's a continuous effort. But I have been impressed with what I have seen, the adaptability, the toughness. And so I think the Russians see this also. And they do not want to get into a head-to-head fight. Of course, the Russians have advantages from the sea and in terms of air power. But I think that the resolve and the toughness of Ukrainian armed forces is going to be a match.
If I'm not mistaken, I think I have read about the research that you were kind of part of, about how quickly Russia can break through Suwalk corridor, and how quickly it can actually get to Baltic countries. What's your assessment from this point of view? So how strong are they indeed, the Russian army, against the eastern Baltic countries and against Ukraine? Are they that strong, as strong as they try to show themselves?
What we're seeing right now is an attempt by the Kremlin to put maximum pressure on Ukraine, on the government, on the people, and also on NATO. So you're seeing everything. Constant video of trains bringing equipment, reports about the Russian Navy converging into the Black Sea, exercises in Belarus. I mean, this is a constant pressure. But still, I'm not convinced that that's enough that they could roll over Ukraine or that they could roll over NATO in the Baltic region. The Suwalki corridor, of course, that's a very potentially vulnerable location because it's so short between Kaliningrad and Belarus. You know, Russian troops in Belarus permanently, that is I think we have to be careful against overestimating Russian capability.
In your recent interview to Ukrainian Suspilne Telebachення, you mentioned that Russia is unable to keep its forces in active readiness near the border for a long time. In your understanding, for how long it can be?
I mean, there's the human factor. You have soldiers away from home, away from families, so there's a morale. You can only keep somebody in a crouch for so long. Then there's the wear and tear on equipment. I mean, whether it's sitting out in bad weather or it's being used repetitively, you have to do maintenance. So you can't just, or you can, but over time it degrades capability. And then there's the cost. This is very expensive. All of these things that the Kremlin has been doing, new camps, movement, fuel, salary, ships, I mean, this is very expensive. And so how much longer can the Kremlin sustain that? You know, probably quite some time, but there's a price to pay domestically. I'm reluctant to put a time limit on it, but I think that pressure back in Russia, domestic pressure, has to be mounting as well, and that the president of the Russian Federation is going to have to show something to explain why they're doing this. And so, you know, perhaps there's we can agree to more transparency on exercises, or maybe Lithuania guarantees they never invade Russia so that he can go home.
Ukraine is receiving a lot of defense assistance now from its partners, and Ukrainians are indeed grateful for that. What can Ukraine's officials, government do more to better prepare themselves for potential escalation? For example, the Ministry of Defense, the Army, what can be done that you see from outside? This is there field to improve?
One thing I believe that the government of Ukraine can do with the Rada is to get all of the leadership in front of the same microphone and demonstrate that all of Ukraine's political parties, the government, the opposition, when it comes to the security of Ukraine, they are completely unified against Russia. That, to me, that is the most important thing that the government can do, is a demonstrated show of solidarity amongst the political leaders. Of course, every nation, certainly you see it in my country, has huge political debates and tensions, of course. But now we're talking about the survival of Ukraine as a state. It's time for a unified, a demonstration of unity by all the leaders. To me, that's number one. Number two, from a practical perspective, taking precautions to improve the resilience of Ukraine's society and infrastructure, cyber, to make sure that Russian cyber cannot wreck the ministries or undermine the Rada, hack into people's computers. This is hard work, and so I think, and very important to protect your networks. I mean, you see we get attacked all the time, Germany gets attacked all the time. And then the third thing I would say is the government can't be just the voice of Ukraine only. I mean, Ukraine is strategically important because of where it is on the map. It's part of the Black Sea. It's not strategically important because how wonderful the people are, the beautiful culture, and the history. That's emotional. That's why we're all here, our delegation. But when you talk strategy, there cannot be emotion. It's got to be about geography and interest. And so I would recommend that the government of Ukraine work closely with Romania, with Georgia, with Turkey, at least, to be a much louder voice in Washington, in Brussels, in Berlin, in Paris. Put your voice together and remind people why the Black Sea is strategically important. It's not just about containing Russia. It's also about a buffer against Iran, against Islamic extremism. It's about huge it's about huge economic potential for the Black Sea to be the corridor between Eurasia and Europe. I mean, but if it's just Ukraine to Washington or just Ukraine to Brussels, I don't think that has the impact.
As you mentioned, the Black Sea, which is really like a risk for us currently as well. How can we defend? What should be done to prepare us better for potential more risks from the Black Sea side?
Part of this, again, is it's got to be a multinational effort, international law to respect sovereignty, waters, so that to help protect Ukraine's coastline. Secondly, there are practical things, of course. Turkey, under the Montreux Convention, has some authority to control what goes through the straits. And if Russia is attacking another Black Sea nation or is violating Montreux with their submarines, then Turkey has some authority to do something about that. But I think Turkey probably does not have any confidence that the United States or Europe would protect them when Moscow would seek retribution. So this is a part of the strategy that we need to address. And then again, in practical terms, Ukraine needs the ability, and NATO needs the ability, to threaten Sevastopol, to make the commander of the Black Sea Fleet feel very uncomfortable in his illegal base. Mm-hmm. So strikes, underwater mines, I mean, things that threaten that port as to tell the Kremlin, like, if you do this, we're going to destroy the base, the whole reason that you went to Crimea. Okay, that's number one. I think that continue to improve anti-ship missiles, like the Neptune, I think, is a Ukrainian system. I would like for the Russians to be very, very worried that Ukraine has the ability to destroy that big illegal bridge over the Kerch Straits. I think that would be quite a symbolic strike. I love bridges, by the way, just not that one.
Is not reasonable. Could you please clarify it also for our viewers? Why is it important to, for example, disclose budget expenditures in during the risks of aggression, even though the risks of aggression are in place? So why it is still important to be more transparent for in terms of defense budget?
Even in the U.S. budget, there's, for special forces and certain intelligence things, only certain members of the Congress get to see that. But that's by agreement with everybody. Everything else, wide open. You can read it online to see what the budget is. So, I mean, let's be serious. The Russians will know how much is being spent, where it's being spent. It's not that hard to find out. So I would argue on people trust their government. They trust the institutions of the government that make the country run. Then that confidence helps them block out Russian disinformation. If they don't trust their government, if they don't trust the Rada, then they're more vulnerable to Russian disinformation. So that's one reason that this sort of oversight is so important, to prevent waste, to prevent fraud. That's why it's important.
We know that many say it's not on the agenda. Ukraine's entrance to NATO is not on the agenda. But if we are getting us prepared for the right momentum, what is good, what is done?
First of all, I think that the United States and Ukraine need to get to a more normalized bilateral relationship. I mean, we don't have an ambassador here yet. We have an excellent embassy team in our charge. Unfortunately, still too many people, when they hear Ukraine, they think Giuliani, Trump. That's not normal. We've got to get to a normal bilateral relationship that has trade, it has cultural exchange, it has security cooperation, all the normal diplomatic things, and where people are investing in Ukraine. Okay, which means you have to have strong, transparent structures in Ukraine. I think then the United States will be better equipped to be the advocate on behalf of Ukraine, because it's not the decision of the United States on whether or not Ukraine comes in. It takes all 30. And so that's why I think keep the door open. I believe that Ukraine should be and will be one day a member of the alliance, just like same for Georgia. But for now, in the meantime, let's focus on building a strong bilateral relationship.
I will try to stick to the most precise questions. And in terms of the hybrid aggression which Ukraine is facing from Russia's side, my question is about the anti-aircraft systems to basically strengthen our air from potential attack.
As you know already, we're shipping Stinger missiles. Some are showing up from some of the other NATO nations, and eventually some will begin to start showing up from the United States, as the Javelin has in the anti-tank. But I think your question is a really good one, because it's more than just Stinger missiles. Being able to defend your airspace starts with having the right radars to see the airspace. It starts with the right command and control to target But then it takes more than low altitude capability, which the Stinger is a low altitude capability. So I think your question is there aid or help needed for medium altitude and high altitude and the more sophisticated systems? And I think the answer is yes. And this is a question of policy for the NATO nations and the United States. Is this the form of help that we want to give? Of course, I would recommend the answer be yes, but it will ultimately be a policy question. And yes, the nations do have these capabilities to share with our Ukrainian brothers and sisters.
Do you think that potentially a non-flying zone is considered as an option in terms of potential?
So I get this question all the time. And one of the things I would remind is that, in essence, a no-fly zone is an act of war. Because if the enemy has air defense systems that it can project into your airspace, and Russia can do that, they can put surface-to-air missiles in Belarus, right along the Russian border, and they can control into Ukrainian airspace from there. And so if we were to try to build a no-fly zone, or any group of nations would try to start a no-fly zone, one of the first actions would be to bomb those sites and eliminate them. So you see, that is really an act of war. So the answer is yes, there are options that nations could put forward. Again, it is a huge policy discussion because it would cause contributing nations to have to bomb Russian capabilities, and that's a big decision. So I think I answered your question sort of two sides of my mouth. You know, yes, we could do it, but it is a big, big policy decision to do that.
Protection of the sea. Which systems could be used to protect the sea? Not probably exclusively provided by the partner countries. Maybe there is something that we can build up ourselves.
Yes. So this is another thing I've talked about just this week, not only with your government and your military, but with my government. Your country is building a capability called the Neptune, but it will be some time before it's there. So these coastal defense cruise missiles, we call them, there are those that other nations could supply. And this is just like the air defense piece. It's not a question of can they? Yes, they can. It's a question of will they adopt the policy to support that? And of course, my recommendation would be yes, but that is something for politicians, not military men and women.
What has improved? What has made us closer to NATO, and what is still in need of?
So let me answer the hard part first. There's still a lot of work to be done. One of the gentlemen in there asked about can we get a map? Well, maybe not. But what you do know is what would be required of you in a map. And you could start working on that now so that nations could see that Ukraine is serious and they're about making those reforms and changes that NATO would require. I'm sorry, I forgot the first part of your question. Yeah, but I'm very proud of what your Army has done. You know, I was the SACEUR when you were first attacked in 13 and 14. And you had a proud Army, but it wasn't ready in a lot of places. It served well. The men and women were brave. No problem with the will to fight, but it needed a lot of change. And what I see now is a very different Army. I'm very proud of the work that your nation and your Army has done over these years. And I think that is something to celebrate. I think there's still more work to be done in the air and at sea, and so that would be what I would focus on now.
If we speak about something that Ukraine can do itself to increase its defense capability, and this is the last question, the last one.
So your country has great capabilities. You build some of the best jet motors in the world. You build great rocket motors. I'm sure that the Neptune is going to be a very good coastal defense cruise missile, maybe accelerate that. So I think that the good news is this is a very technically capable country, that when it focuses, on doing things for itself, it can go a long way. I think one of the tough questions, you're not going to like this question, but right now some of your defense industries are really focused on producing things to sell elsewhere. Maybe we need to turn internal and produce stuff to make our own Army, Navy, and Air Force better.
As NATO is a civil society organization which promotes transparency in the defense sector, I expect you have seen in different countries some kind of initiatives promoting more transparency in defense budgets, etc. Do you believe that if there are organizations like that, if they strive for more transparency, it has real benefit for the defense sector?
It does. It's the same remark I made earlier when the gentleman was talking about, can we get a map? Well, whether you get a map now or not, you can start working on the things that a map would require. And one of them is this reform and transparency. Continue to work on that, because that gives the nations now that are worried about giving you a map, it shows them that you're ready to move forward and you're beginning to work on that. So I would highly recommend.
Thank you so much.
And I think you have seen in the last month and a half an effort by the United States and Europe to do more on a couple of ways. First is to provide more military assistance and defensive equipment to Ukraine. And that's where I disagree, where people say, well, we shouldn't do that because it might make it more likely. I actually think by giving the Ukrainian military better capabilities to defend Ukraine, that is more likely to help deter the Kremlin from deciding to attack in the first place. Another thing that I think is also that NATO is looking at is, can you bolster NATO's military presence on the eastern flank, the Baltic states and Poland, which I think is also a signal to the Kremlin that the West takes as a very serious threat. But I'm not sure there's much more that Ukraine needs to do on this one. This is really, I think, that one that the Western Alliance has to work out. Well, I think certainly we've seen in the last several years Ukraine do more to increase its defense capability. I think there are important things that Ukraine, though, can and should be doing. Is one, you want to make sure that you're getting the maximum value for defense dollars. And this is something we cope with in the United States, too, and it's one thing that the American Congress is very interested in. When we spend a large amount of money, is that money being used in the most efficient way possible, and are we getting the best capability for that? So I think that's actually one thing that Ukraine can work on. I mean, you want to, for example, transparency is important. You want, for example, the relevant committees in the Rada to be able to monitor how money is spent, and the public. I mean, the press should be able to monitor that. I mean, people should have. There may be some closed programs that are secret, but the bulk of the program should be fairly open. So transparency is important for accountability reasons.
And you asked it before my asking. I just wanted to mention that in my personal assessment as a NATO representative, the biggest achievements in the sector which have been done are the law on defense procurement and the law on corporatization of Ukроборонпром. In both cases, these are the laws which promote more transparency in the sector. And at the same time, there are narratives which are still kind of common to claim that more transparency is harmful, more transparency in the defense sector is more harmful for the country in the context of aggression. So let's hide everything possible, otherwise the Russians will know everything about our defense. What would be your answer to that?
No, the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense has the assumption that Russian intelligence is pretty active in this country. So my guess is the Russians have a pretty good idea how Ukraine is spending its defense dollars. So you don't want to have a situation where the Russian intelligence knows, but the Rada does not know and the public doesn't know. But even in that situation where take the Russian intelligence out of it, I think if you look at the trade-off, I guess I would still be inclined to say that the benefits of transparency in terms of accountability with regards to money, that you're getting the best amount of impact for the money that you spend, and in terms of perverting competition probably outweigh the costs of, then the Russians have that information as well. Now, there may be some certain programs. So, for example, in the United States, the B-21 bomber, we know that the Air Force is spending a lot of money to develop the B-21 bomber. We have some idea how much the whole program costs. There are not a lot of details, but that's purposeful because the Air Force, understandably, we do want to hide the capabilities of that aircraft from the Russians or from the Chinese or from other potential adversaries. But that's not the whole program. I mean, we have certain programs that are basically in the black. They're kept secret. But it's a relatively small portion of the overall defense budget.
It's a difficult, difficult issue to deal with. Let's come back to countering the risks of Russia's aggression. We have heard a lot recently from world top officials about the possible sanctions that even bigger sanctions that could be applied against the Kremlin. We also have heard that Mr. Biden, President Biden, mentioned Russia can be cut off dollars in the banks.
Yeah.
So, in your opinion, what's the possibility that this strong financial sanctions could deter?
Yeah. Western sanctions on Russia are about a 3. So you could crank them up a lot. And what they've said now in the administration, they said is, look, if the Russian military makes a new assault into Ukraine, we will not apply the sanctions gradually. We're going to hit all the sanctions at once. And now, they don't have a specific list. I think the reality is, before you can work out a specific list with a finalized list with the Europeans, they'll have to see the nature of the Russian attack. But they've been talking with the Europeans about this for 2 months now. And I think there are a lot of common ideas. I would say financial sanctions that would be targeting Russian financial institutions, making sanctions that would make it difficult to hold Russian sovereign debt. If Western banks can't hold Russian sovereign debt, it becomes very hard for them to find debt holders. They're talking about new sanctions that would look at export controls. And this is one where the United States has a lot of power, because a lot of the technology and semiconductors originates in the United States. And the United States can turn that flow off to Russia. And so I think there's a pretty wide range of sanctions which will be very painful to Russia. Now, I don't know if those sanctions by themselves would deter the Russians, but that's why there's also more military assistance to Ukraine, more military presence on NATO's eastern flank. But to my mind, the big cost is going to be inflicted by, will be the Ukrainian cost. And that is, the Russian military is larger, it's better funded, but I do think that the Ukrainian military, and if necessary, will inflict significant costs on the Russians. And my own view is, I don't think Vladimir Putin cares about dead Russian soldiers, but he cares a lot about how that impacts the domestic opinion towards the Kremlin. So I'm hoping that accumulation of sanctions will be such that at the end of the day, the Kremlin says, those prices are too heavy, we don't want to pay that. And that they will decide, to back down, and there is a negotiating path forward.
I cannot have the interview without asking about Ukraine's NATO perspectives.
Yeah.
How would I shape the question? Is that Ukraine, the recent opinion poll says that Ukrainians, 59% of Ukrainians would like to join. I also saw a very recent poll abroad by Yalta Conference, which says that in certain countries, big NATO countries, the support for that is like 51%, in many of them less.
Yeah.
What do you think could be done to increase that support abroad by the power by the people?
My guess is that the inclination of European states to want to commit to defend Ukraine is going to be higher to the extent that they look at Ukraine, they see. Now, on the broader question, it's a tough question for Ukraine. My answer to Ukraine's membership in NATO is not now, but not never. And not now reflects reality. And here's the problem. Russian troops occupy Crimea. Russian troops are in Donbass. The question that you would get from NATO members, and this is why I think at this point in time there's not a lot of enthusiasm for putting Ukraine on a membership track, is let's say, okay, today's Monday, let's say Tuesday Ukraine joins NATO. On Wednesday, is NATO then obligated to go to war against Russia under Article 5? And I think part of the reason that the Russians have taken Crimea and Donbass, just as they hold on to Transnistria and South Ossetia and Abkhazia, is because they understand that that's going to create that hesitation in NATO before NATO countries are going to be prepared to move forward. And that's why I think it's probably, at this point in time, instead of talking about membership, it makes more sense for Ukraine to focus on doing the reforms, getting things in place so that it will be ready for membership if a political window opens up for it.
You mentioned peaceful resolution in Donbass. We have the renewal of the Normandy discussions. And my question to you is, do you believe there could be some serious negotiation process if the Crimea is put out of the whole framework of negotiation, or should it all go together as one set?
I think for the Russians there's a big difference between Crimea and Donbass. They want Crimea. They moved very quickly to annex it. They haven't done that with Donbass. And I think the Russians look at occupied Donbass. I don't think they want to annex it, because I think they understand it would be very expensive to rehabilitate it after 8 years of conflict. But what they do is they see it as a mechanism. It's a way to put pressure on the government of Kyiv, to distract, to destabilize it. So what that means, though, is that resolving Donbass, I think, is much easier than Crimea. So the policy I think that Ukraine has focused on the last 6 or 7 years is focus on trying to Donbass while keeping Crimea as a longer issue probably remains a wise one. And I think you can do both. It's hard right now to say how does Ukraine muster the political, economic, military, diplomatic leverage to get Crimea back. Analytically, I think it's very hard to do right now. But politically, I think it's also the United States and Europe should continue the policy of non-recognition. Bear in mind with the Baltic states. So I think that gives Ukraine kind of the ability to focus on Donbass, and then Crimea is a longer-term question.